Kia ora koutou, everybody. I'm not really used to speaking into a microphone because I've got a really loud voice anyway, but I've got one. So that's, yeah, I'm really, really pleased to be introducing Professor Richard Jackson. It's a real honour. We've had Richard for the afternoon, and that's been incredibly interesting. And it's just a shame that we've only got about an hour, just over an hour, to spend time with Richard, because he really is an extremely expert. He is extremely expert in a number of areas. So he's talking today, as you know, about the idea of abolishing the military, which is only really a small part of his work, but for us today it's a really important kaupapa. So Richard, behind this work there sits a huge body of other academic work, something like 100 articles and book chapters. Also, he's the editor of Critical Studies in Terrorism, and he's written a novel as well, and he has something like 15 other books. So he's can I share that other stuff about you? That he's a fly fisher and a blues guitarist and singer. So unfortunately we've only got a little while to hear him talk about abolishing the military. So it's based on, as many of you will know, this book Abolishing the Military, which he's written with Griffin Leonard and also Joseph Llewellyn. And for those of you, I've got my copy here, and I told Richard not to say they were discounted copies, but they are special event price copies of this book that you can help yourself to after paying $10 or making a commitment to pay $10. It's a great book. I've used it a lot and shared it with my friends, and it's really informed my thinking. And within our particular group, which is Stop AUKUS, there's a huge amount of data, really helpful data and evidence behind Richard's theses that are sitting in this book. So without any more, I'll let Richard take it. Thanks, Richard.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa, rangi mari e kia koutou. I'm Richard Jackson, and it's my pleasure to be speaking with you tonight, and I really appreciate the invitation. Yeah, as Margaret said, this is going to be a talk that kind of summarizes and puts forward some of the key arguments that we make in this book. We're trying to create a public conversation. And so my talk is deliberately, I think, polemical and provocative, and it's aimed at challenging our common sense understanding of the military and hopefully provoking a public debate through offering some new arguments and perspectives that might not be familiar, or which are rarely heard in public debate, particularly in New Zealand, where issues around the military and foreign affairs are often more of an elite concern than a public issue. Now, obviously, in giving this particular talk, I have to acknowledge that it's a very difficult argument to make in the current historical moment when Israel is attacking Gaza in response to the Hamas terrorist attack last year, and Russia has invaded Ukraine. I was reading a book the other day which is entitled something like A Pacifist Case in the context of the Ukraine war, and the author was saying that she was often challenged by people asking, how can you be a pacifist at this time? And her answer was, how can you not be a pacifist at this time? Particularly when you look at the kind of destruction that that military force is causing. In any event, in the midst of a violent crisis like the one that we're currently in, perspectives and options often contract to a single, seemingly unarguable necessity to respond in kind. This is in part because the effects of violence is, as the philosopher Elaine Scarry reminds us, to shatter our worlds and eradicate thought and language. It is also because violence is inherently mimetic. It provokes us at the affective level, in part because we've been primed to respond to violence in particular ways. Nevertheless, and notwithstanding the shock and dismay of the current moment, a key point I'm going to try and make is that it's precisely because we've ignored and neglected some of the arguments that I'm going to make here in the past that we're facing this situation today. Over previous centuries, we have made and reinforced with our militarism and our own actions and inactions a world in which such violent conflicts are virtually inevitable. We've constructed the political, cultural, economic, and moral structures necessary for continuous war and normalized military violence as a kind of regularized, recurring, and enduring social practice. We've made war part of our world and part of our reality. Now, notwithstanding the limits of analogies, it's a bit like a situation, I believe, where an apartment block is on fire and at risk of burning down. At that moment, you don't want to think about the cladding the block was built with and whether all the necessary safety measures were properly adhered to. You just want to stop the fire, evacuate the people, and prevent it from spreading. However, at some point, it will be necessary to consider how building materials, evacuation procedures, and other safety measures are put in place in future. It won't be enough to just keep calling the fire department every time a fire breaks out. The prevention of fires has to become the priority, and it's the same with war and militarism. So, there's no single knockout argument for abolishing the military, but I think if we put all the arguments that I'm going to tell you together, I think there's a compelling case for giving the proposition serious consideration in our public conversations. And the first thing I want to talk about is that there are a whole series of arguments about why military force is actually a failure for security and foreign policy. And these reasons collectively provide a good argument for abolishing the military. So the first point is that there's a growing empirical evidence from scholarly analysis for the failure of violence. There are studies on war, terrorism, torture, targeted killings, great power wars, and so on, which all demonstrate a limited and in some cases declining utility for the use of violence. For example, there's evidence that the states with the greatest military capabilities in material terms are no more likely to win wars than states with weaker capabilities. And in the past few decades, these strong states are winning wars less often than in previous centuries. There's also evidence that when states use military force and violent repression to try and suppress popular protest, it rarely works. There's also evidence to show that the use of military force or violence to try and protect civilians at risk of armed groups in situations of war or repression also rarely works. The evidence also suggests that when states rely on military force to try and deter or counter terrorist attacks, it most often doesn't work, or it makes the situation worse. And we know that from studies on the war on terror from the past 20 years. There's strong evidence that the use of torture and drone killings are ineffective, and there's a lot of evidence as well from the other side that the use of terrorism and insurgency is also ineffective. So the US failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, Russia's failure in Ukraine following its earlier failure in Afghanistan, as well as Israel's failures in Gaza, South Lebanon, the West Bank, and elsewhere over many decades, and then as well as groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, all these are failures, and they're only the most recent examples of how violence is very unlikely to achieve its political or strategic goals. Now, the reasons why the use of violence is such a failure empirically is in large part because it's rooted in a common misunderstanding of the relationship between violence, coercion, and power. The effectiveness of violence in deterring or compelling others depends entirely on how people respond to the threat or use of violence, not the violence itself. The ability to hurt and destroy actually has little relationship to the ability to coerce and compel. And there's no greater example of that right at this minute than Gaza, where despite Israel's smashing of Gaza, it hasn't deterred Hamas at all. Hamas continues to fight. In other words, power does not come from the barrel of a gun. Violence and its threat does not translate into power. It can just as easily provoke resistance and defiance. The Taliban, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and many others are examples of this. As the philosopher Hannah Arendt put it, power and violence are opposites, where the one rules absolutely, the other is absent. Violence can destroy power, it is utterly incapable of creating it. As a consequence of this, we can argue that violence is actually too unpredictable in its effects to be used as a rational tool or an instrument of power. Another argument here, because sometimes it's argued that, well, the point of the military is actually to save others, saving strangers, or military-based forms of humanitarian intervention and peacekeeping. In fact, the record on this is similarly very, very poor. The failure in Libya, following from earlier failures in Somalia, Rwanda, Bosnia, the DRC, and many others, is only the most recent. In the case of New Zealand, the only clear case of peacekeeping success is the Bougainville intervention, which actually involved unarmed peacekeepers. So the overall assessment from years of academic research would suggest that peacekeeping and humanitarian intervention contributes very little to international peace and security, which I think undermines again an argument for the military. The historical record of the military over hundreds of years clearly demonstrates, and this is an important point that a lot of people don't acknowledge, that it is more often used for internal repression against the state's citizens than it is for the protection of the state's citizens. There's a famous study by Rommel called Death by Government, which documents more than 100 million people killed in the 20th century by their own governments. But certainly in New Zealand and elsewhere, including Britain, the military was the primary tool of colonialism and indigenous dispossession. And it is arguably still a tool of neocolonialism and imperialism. Israel's violence against the Palestinians, for example, the role of US military bases around the world, French intervention in Africa, UK arms sales to client regimes in the Middle East, all of these kind of indicate or are continuations of colonial power projected through the military. There's also an argument to be made about what I have called asymmetry and the delusions of national defense in a world of few great powers. There's a few middle powers and a majority of small powers in the world, and then a very small group of great powers. And the disparity in military power between New Zealand and most other states, for example, makes national military defense a naive delusion. I mean, most states in the world could not actually defend themselves if a powerful state tried to invade them. Now, what this does is it elevates the importance of military alliances, but in fact there are also questions, serious questions about military alliances. And first of all, whether military alliances actually escalate conflicts and tensions and make wars more likely. And then secondly, whether military alliances are genuinely reliable as a form of national security. And the arguments coming around Ukraine and the Western support for it arguably point to this dilemma. Another key argument here is that there is actually a changing nature of military conflict going on. Particularly the rise of what's been called hybrid warfare and the continuing effectiveness of what we would call unconventional insurgency. And what this means is that more and more conventional military forces are unable to defeat asymmetric opponents. So Israel's inability to defeat Hamas, Russia's failures in Ukraine, the US failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, and many other cases mean that the gap between possessing major military capabilities and the achievement of strategic and political goals is getting larger and larger. State militaries are no longer really fit for purpose when it comes to fighting unconventional foes. I mean, I had a very interesting experience last year when I was on sabbatical and I went to Taiwan, and it was at a time of heightened tension, and I asked the people I was with there at the different universities I was visiting, are you worried about an invasion by China and perhaps them occupying you? And they said, no, we're not afraid, because if they invaded and occupied us, we would fight like the Taliban. In other words, there's a message or a lesson that's gone out around the world, which is that you don't need to have advanced military technology to defeat a superpower. You can do it with Kalashnikovs and pickup trucks as long as you're in for the long haul and use unconventional weaponry. Now this is important because it means that the way we configure militaries might not actually be appropriate for the kinds of warfare that they're tasked with undertaking. In relation to this, we could also think about the changing nature of security threats themselves, which are making the military somewhat anachronistic. For example, the military has limited or no relevance today for protecting people from the real and growing forms of insecurity such as climate change, pandemics, inequality, terrorism, misinformation, and political polarization. And in fact, it may even exacerbate some of these very problems. All it can do in a few cases, and as I said, most states are small and cannot even do this, is respond in kind to direct military attack by another state. I don't have time to go into it, but there are other ethical arguments about war, violence, and just war theory in particular, which we could make, which would further bolster the argument for military abolition, as well as arguments about whether violence is really compatible with politics, or whether it's actually a form of anti-politics, and whether it's compatible with liberalism and democracy. For a variety of understandable but well-documented reasons, wars can never be conducted cleanly or humanely. They always involve extreme violence, crimes against humanity, brutal atrocities, torture, and the like. And we see this clearly after every single war, such as the torture, rendition, and targeted killings of the war on terror that, you know, even countries like New Zealand, but certainly Australia, the US, the UK, Canada, and others are trying to deal with today. The UK already faced this many times in places like Northern Ireland, Kenya, Aden, Malaya, India, and elsewhere. And we're seeing it today in Gaza, the Ukraine, Sudan, Myanmar, and elsewhere. I mean, there are just no examples of what we might think of as clean or clearly just wars. And then the final argument I want to make in this section is that military violence is sometimes argued to be a useful tool that a state can have to use if it needs it. But I would argue that that is not really possible. This is because of the constitutive nature of military violence. In empirical research, the use of military violence has been shown to be a strong predictor of future episodes of political violence. And the possession of militaries creates what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy, or in international relations we call this the security dilemma. Military force and its use creates or constitutes the conditions for its own perpetuation, in part by bringing in militarism into the legal system. You have to have laws that regulate when violence can be legally undertaken. it comes into the cultural system, it comes into the economic system, and it comes into the scientific and educational system, and it becomes, in that sense, a real shaper of society. Beyond this, it also has an effective pull in that it draws in people, in part through things like war films and the kind of glorification of military violence, through cultural products, novels, video games, and so on. In sum, I believe that there is a kind of naive idealism expressed by the advocates and proponents of military force about what it can achieve, what it can be used for, what good it can really do. And there are so few cases of its effectiveness or genuine utility, and almost endless cases of its demonstrable harmfulness, that it seems naive to ever assume that its use will end well. To paraphrase Gandhi, the good that violence can do is always temporary, but the harm that it does is permanent. Just give me a second here, I haven't got enough hands. So thus far, I've just been talking about some of the general arguments that we make in this book about questioning why we might. Oh, that would be great. Yes.
Your other hand.
There we go. Sorry, some water on the back of my throat. About why we might consider abolishing the military. I mean, another angle to look at this is to weigh up the costs of militarism and consider whether they balance out with the purported benefits of militarism. So if we look at the long-term real costs of war and militarism, I believe that the costs of them far outweigh any of the good that their proponents argue comes to society. And at the very most basic level, we could think about the human costs, the deaths, injuries, and refugees, for example. There's a group at Brown University in the United States that has a website called The Costs of War that have been looking at closely the costs of the war on terror since 9/11. And their most recent study documents more than 4.5 million lives lost in direct and indirect consequences of US military intervention overseas since the start of the war on terror, as well as an estimated 38 million people displaced. But to this, we could also add the long-term PTSD amongst soldiers, the moral injury that's been done to soldiers, and there's a great book by Ned Dobos in Australia about the kind of harm that's done to soldiers, even just in their training. 30,000 US military personnel have committed suicide since returning from deployment in Iraq or Afghanistan, plus very high numbers of disabled, homeless, and addicted former service personnel. So, I mean, the costs of this, and you only have to look at Gaza on your television every night to see the human costs there. But there's also the material costs of war and military operations to social environments, economic production, food security, cultural resources. I mean, I'm sure you're aware of the long-term effects of landmines and unexploded ordnance around the world that kills, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people every year and makes vast tracts of the world unable to be grown food. A recent report shows long-term health effects, negative health effects of depleted uranium on Iraqi citizens. Then there's the environmental costs of the military and its activities. A growing body of research demonstrates that the world's military forces contribute more greenhouse emissions than many major industrialized countries. and most national militaries are exempt from emissions targets or even from emissions records. The climate change that the military makes a major contribution to is in itself an indirect cause of violent group conflict, violence, and insecurity. I mean, if we look at the first 2 months of the Israeli attack on Gaza, according to a recent Guardian report, it produced more planet-warming gases than 20 climate-vulnerable nations do in a year. And then there's the opportunity costs of maintaining a military. And I know there are people here who've come up with figures for how this might apply to New Zealand. But at the most basic level, we can note that one Tomahawk cruise missile costs about $2 million US, enough to pay the annual salary of 28 NHS nurses in the UK. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, calculated that global military expenditure in 2015 was $1.7 trillion. It's probably well over $2 trillion now. And that's just 10% of what was needed to cover the costs of global goals aimed at ending poverty and hunger in 15 years. Certainly, if states had invested a few billion in their public health systems instead of the military, they might have been able to save a substantial number of the 7 million or more lives lost to COVID in the pandemic. A lot of people don't know this. In the United States, the US military requires a huge blood bank to be maintained for its personnel in case of overseas deployments, even while the civilian sector often faces shortages of donated blood. And I'm sure you all know Dwight Eisenhower's famous statement in 1953. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone, it is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 population. It is 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. It is some 50 miles of concrete highway. We pay for a single fighter plane with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. So those are some of the costs which we have to calculate in when we debate whether or not the military is something that we really need. And you know, we can have a debate about the kind of costs that we're currently incurring for the NZDF and whether or not particularly those opportunity costs could be better spent on improving people's lives across society. Now, the case for military abolition, I think, is bolstered even further when we consider that there are alternatives to it. There are other and perhaps better ways to do things like disaster relief, law and order, aid delivery, and there are also alternative ways to pursue goals of national security, peacekeeping, humanitarian intervention, and positive political change. And again, I don't have time to go into it, but we talk about this in the book. There's a huge body of research out there now on what's called nonviolent resistance, and the way in which it can be used effectively to bring about political change, including improved human rights, democratic change, and so on. And the empirical findings on nonviolent revolutions and political change, democracy and human rights shows that it's much more effective than violence, than military intervention, and so on. It's not a panacea, it's not perfect, and there have been clear failures, but the empirical record is actually quite impressive. And the theoretical reasoning behind it is very strong. And it ought to be taken much more seriously, and I think attempted much more, especially when the empirical record and the demonstrated harms of military violence is so much greater. I mean, it seems to me that when we face these situations internationally, the first impulse is to, use violent military force, whereas I don't think we spend enough time trying these alternatives first. Then there's a whole literature on what's been called social defense, which is trying to defend countries nationally without a military, but through mass civil resistance and civil disobedience. So, I mean, each country would have to come up with its own strategy. But for example, some of the theorists talk about you could have an organized system for New Zealand, for example, whereby if an invading force was heading towards us, we could, in the first instance, have hundreds of people go out and park all their cars, take out the spark plugs on the runways so that no foreign plane could land. All the boaties could go out at the edge of the harbour and scuttle their ships so that no ship could come in. All cars could go to all the major highways coming into the capital city and again park their cars and take the spark plugs out, so that there would be a huge logistical effort by an invading army required to even enter the place. I mean, that probably wouldn't deter them, but it would make it very costly. But then we would have a whole series of rolling forms of civil disobedience and resistance, whereby we, hit all the electricians and all the train drivers and all the people vital to running the economy, so that they would have to bring in all their own people. We wouldn't serve them food at cafes. We wouldn't cooperate with them. We wouldn't teach the curriculums that they put forward and so on, like they did in the Nordic countries when the Nazis occupied. I mean, there are just so many, hundreds of different strategies that can be employed, and that these would, form a kind of a resistance that would possibly deter countries from invading, but also, I mean, it would make it very difficult for them to achieve any real benefits out of invading. We can debate these, but the point is there are some countries like Lithuania, for example, which have put social defense into their constitution because they used it quite effectively to push out the Russians in the early 1990s, using mass non-violent resistance. Then there is unarmed peacekeeping, which I've alluded to, and this has the potential to bring many benefits, and it's been demonstrably effective at civilian protection, reducing levels of violence and creating dialogue between armed groups in a growing number of documented cases. And there's a growing body of research which suggests that it represents a genuine alternative to military peacekeeping. As I mentioned, New Zealand's involvement in the Bougainville conflict in Papua New Guinea clearly demonstrated how effective unarmed peacekeepers could be in helping to end a destructive civil war. And then finally, there's been a lot of research, some of which that I've been doing on on how responding to terrorism through non-violent forms of counterterrorism and sort of community-based forms of security can be much more effective than using military force. Now, despite all these arguments, the fact that I think that there are alternatives to the military, that the costs of the military are so horrendously high, and that there are all these other arguments about the use of force doesn't really create power and so on and so forth. There's a lot of objections to the argument that we make in this book, and I'd like to just briefly touch on them before finishing. So the first objection that we often hear is that if you abolish the military, it would make states more vulnerable to predation and thereby reduce security. It would encourage more military invasions from those states who didn't disarm, and it would remove the deterrent value of possessing a military. I mean, that's a strong argument, but actually the evidence for all of those is fairly mixed. And, we would argue that civilian defense, social defense, could theoretically provide a strong deterrent, and in any case, it would undermine what we call the security dilemma, which is one of the main causes of international insecurity, which is that when you don't have a military, you're no threat to any other state. So therefore, the other states have very few reasons to fear you or to arm against you, and it also reduces the possibility of these kind of escalatory cycles that can lead to a miscommunication and then some kind of military blowout. And as I argued, similarly, peacekeeping and working with allies is often argued as a reason for having the military. But as we've talked about, peacekeeping, and in particular in New Zealand's case, working with allies, particularly the Anglosphere, has demonstrably not really contributed to international peace and security. In fact, it could be well argued that it's helped to increase the kinds of tensions that we're seeing today. Another argument is that it would reduce the state's power. If states didn't have militaries, they'd lose power. But as I mentioned, I think this mistakes the nature of power. And in fact, there are many other forms of power that can be wielded in international politics, particularly those based on reputation or influence or economic power, cultural power. And so I'm not sure that is, a kind of seriously damaging argument. Another argument is that the military provides a lot more benefits to society than just defence. In New Zealand, it's often argued that the military is valuable because it can engage in disaster relief, search and rescue, bolstering law and order, employment for youth, education and training, and so on. I mean, we would argue that is true, but perhaps these roles could be better done with dedicated and specially trained and equipped bodies. Sometimes the military is unavailable for these roles because they're actually deployed overseas. And as we saw from the report on the recent the floods and the role of the military in that, sometimes they don't do a very good job. So again, I'm not sure that is a really compelling argument against not abolishing the military. I think a more powerful argument is that the military is more than just instrumental. It's actually central to national identity. War commemorations, the military institution, and so on are symbolic of the nation and provide a unifying set of symbols, rituals, and myths. And that is true, very much so in New Zealand. I mean, one of the problems here is that such a view has to suppress contradictory or unpleasant histories, parts of the history, such as the use of the military in internal repression in New Zealand. The NZDF was formed in part to suppress Indigenous resistance and played a historic role in violent dispossession and the construction of Pākehā power. Later on, there was differential treatment of Māori service personnel after World War I and World War II. And then I think the broader point is that all nations, including Aotearoa, have peace traditions as well as military traditions. And there's something of a choice involved in which tradition you choose to emphasize, and therefore which tradition plays that role of creating a unifying identity. And I think New Zealand could have a strong unifying identity as, a global leader in the anti-nuclear peace movement, and as a peacemaker, both in the region and globally, which would be an alternative identity to the kind of Anzac myth. So in conclusion, on the preponderance of arguments and evidence, I believe that there's a strong case to abolish the military. It's a costly, largely ineffective, harmful, and somewhat anachronistic institution. And I think that there would be a great many immediate and long-term benefits to abolishing it. To mention a few, abolishing the military would be a major contribution to the struggle to avoid climate catastrophe. Abolishing the military would take us a step closer to perhaps decolonizing the state and our societies. particularly for settler states like New Zealand and colonial states like Britain. Abolishing the military would release vast quantities of much-needed resources, which could be used for enhancing human security through measures such as climate mitigation, poverty alleviation, public health, education, reducing domestic violence, and many other social ills which cause death and harm to so many, but which are underfunded. Abolishing the military could protect future generations from the harms of war and militarism by reducing the number of people who would otherwise go on to suffer death, disability, displacement, moral injury, PTSD, and so on. By abolishing the military and replacing it with social defense, citizens would be empowered and democratic participation would be enhanced. From the perspective of political theory, abolishing the military could see the prefiguration of new forms of power and politics, rooted in collective action, radical democracy, and solidarity, instead of current forms of power which are rooted in violent domination and coercion. Abolishing the military could help contribute to the building of a new kind of world order, where invasions like Gaza and Ukraine are perhaps a lot less likely. It could help create more peacemaking nations and fewer security dilemmas. It could help break the embedded cycles of war and save future generations from the harms and costs of war. And I want to end by saying that such possibilities are not unrealistic or historically unheard of. Costa Rica provides a pertinent example of military abolition. It abolished its military, its standing army, rather, in 1949, following a civil war, and it's remained largely free of large-scale internal conflict as well as external wars ever since. Its military budget was subsequently reallocated to security, welfare, and culture with extraordinary results. So a couple of years ago, the Guardian newspaper reported the following, and I quote, "Every few years, the New Economics Foundation publishes the Happy Planet Index, a measure of progress that looks at life expectancy, well-being, and equality rather than the narrow metric of GDP, and plots these measures against ecological impact. Costa Rica tops the list of countries every time. With a life expectancy of 79.1 years and levels of well-being in the top 7% of the world, Costa Rica matches many Scandinavian nations in these areas and neatly outperforms the United States. And it manages all of this with a GDP per capita of only $10,000, less than 1/5 that of the US. In this sense, Costa Rica is the most efficient economy on earth. It produces high standards of living with low GDP and minimal pressure on the environment." Now, the article went on to suggest that the reason for this extraordinary success was all down to Costa Rica's commitment to universalism, and I quote again, "The principle that everyone, regardless of income, should have equal access to generous, high-quality social services as a basic right. A series of progressive governments started rolling out healthcare, education, and social security in the 1940s and expanded these to the whole population from the 1950s onward, after abolishing the military and freeing up more resources for social spending." I think that might be a good place to start the conversation. Thank you.
I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people who want to put forward some more ideas about social defence, not just the spark plugs out of cars, but I'm sure we can think about a few more. But I've been thinking about those. But there are a lot of other issues and questions that I'm sure you want to raise with Richard. I think Philip's got them.
Okay, thanks. I could happily abolish the New Zealand military tomorrow, and I don't think most of us would notice. But the US is a different question. And when I think about US wars, what they usually seem to do is go in on behalf of somebody's little independence movement or some local thing and do proxy wars. And the country then, which has disrupted their economy, etc., is disrupted by what is happening, they then become dependent on all the the US money and military and procurement contracts, and then have their country totally distorted. And it's hard to think of a war that was actually a US war. You probably know of some, but yeah, they all seem to go in another kind of way for the benefit of involving their military and their armaments industry. And somehow the country involved gets hooked in. Can you comment on that, or?
Well, no, just to say that, yeah, that's true. And, you know, what I'm talking about here is, unfortunately, I can't come up with a plan for the United States. I mean, it's the most powerful military in the world. But what I would say is that it kind of illustrates many of the problems that we highlight in this book, which is that, you know, despite the US's military power and the way in which it's always willing to use that as kind of a power projection, you know, its influence in the world is declining. And that's because it's not a form of power. It's a national delusion to think that because they spend the most on the military and they have the most advanced military technology and force and so on, that they can get their way around the world. But, you know, as they found out in Vietnam and Somalia and Lebanon and now Afghanistan, but also Iraq for 15 years, I mean, military force does not translate into being able to achieve strategic or political objectives. And most often it produces forms of what we call blowback and unanticipated consequences that end up being very, very costly for itself. I mean, the war on terror is a perfect example. It's been hugely costly to the American economy, trillions upon trillions of dollars. And the trillions that they're going to need to support all the soldiers who are disabled going forward is just astounding. I mean, it just kind of illustrates the futility of the use of force, in my mind. But I guess it also illustrates how embedded the belief in the military is and how embedded militarism is everywhere. It's not just the United States. Most societies, based on hundreds, maybe thousands of years, believe that war is a thing that you just need to do sometimes, and that having militaries is normal, and that you can achieve your political goals that way. But, I mean, I would just look at the world as it is right at this minute and question that. I mean, what is it good for? As they used to say in Vietnam.
Kia ora. Thank you for so eloquently expressing what I think a lot of us probably feel and believe. So my question is around that we're just over a week away from Anzac Day, and I think it's fair to say that day is laden with emotion and, you know, good intention and will towards how do we recognise service. But at the same time, although there is a slogan, lest we forget, I think it's fair to say that the day itself upholds the kind of ongoing commitment to military. So I just wonder how you think, or what ideas you have around approaching that day and how that might fit into this greater conversation about abolishing the military.
Yeah, look, I mean, this is something that's been dear to my heart for many, many years, and I have a blog, which I haven't written in for a few years, but I wrote in it about why I wear a white poppy rather than a red poppy at Anzac. And interestingly enough, I wrote that blog post when I was in the United Kingdom, and at the time, John Key responded and said, you know, what the hell are you talking about? That's dishonorable. But the reason I do that is because, from my understanding, the Peace Pledge Union, which started the kind of white poppy tradition, emerged in the 1930s when they felt that commemoration of war began to take on more of a triumphalist kind of approach. They used to have victory bulls that went along with it. And they felt that the real meaning of remembering should be not lest we forget, but never again. And so I've always taken that attitude that we honor the dead by making sure never again, that no one else has to suffer that, that no one else has to kill or be killed. And so I think there are alternative ways of commemorating and remembering and kind of narrativizing what it is that we're doing that would perhaps undermine the militaristic aspects of this tradition and of these forms of memorialization, which, to be honest, really do, in my view, often cut out the politics and make it possible for politicians to use that myth to get us into the next war. We have to go and fight whoever it is because it's the Anzac tradition. That's what we do. Rather than remembering for never again and remembering for the abolition of war.
We've got one question here, and then we've got three over there, and then we've got one at the back, and then we've got one in the front.
One here and then one here.
I might be subverting things, Philip.
I'm not sure if it's a question, but I'd like you to respond to it. The problem with many of these wars, I mean, you say that great powers aren't very successful in their goals, and that's based on an assumption as to what the goals are. I mean, the American military industry makes enormous profits, and without wars it can't make profits. And there have been a number of American politicians from the highest in the land saying that the war in Ukraine is great because it's a good investment and no Americans are dying and we're making all this money. And that actually leads to where this stuff is coming from, I believe. So undercutting the ability to make profit from war, I think, is probably more important than abolishing militaries. I think they would die a natural death if you couldn't have that profit motive in the most powerful country in the world.
Yeah, look, I'm sure you're right. I mean, this is one of the key problems, is that, particularly the sort of, I suppose, the privatization and capitalization of military technology and procurement and supply creates these inbuilt interests and imperatives to keep the war going. I mean, it's much, much worse even than you say. I mean, right now we know that Israeli military arms suppliers are advertising their wares by saying, look how effective they are in Gaza. I mean, it's just horrendous. That's happening right now. So I think, the kind of military industrial complex, if you like, as it was called by Eisenhower as well, is a huge, huge problem, and we really have to mobilize against that.
Kia ora, thank you, Richard. My head's spinning with all the ways in which you've constructed the argument and circled around it. And I'm thinking, my want is to think, righto, it's great, let's try and do it now. How would we make this happen? When you're in a small country and you can't kind of influence everything in the world, you start thinking about, well, what could you do back home? And one of the things I've been thinking about as you talked is, how do you distinguish between the military and the police? In the sense that one idea you could romantically have is that we could, in New Zealand, transform our military into something that was an international police force, because we do get feedback that they do very well in that space. There's a lot of things that make New Zealanders function well in post-conflict situations. So in your mind, what is the distinction between our military out in the world and our police at home? Is it completely different?
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting question. I mean, like our police, who are unarmed, I would be very happy to see unarmed-ish. Well, I mean, they don't carry weapons openly on the beat, as it were. I mean, it's sad the way they're becoming more militarized in that sense. But if they could be unarmed, then an international police force would be great, because to my mind, the police are trained in conflict resolution, diffusing situations, protecting the public, protecting property and so on. Protection is at the heart of it. Whereas the military, as their own publicity will tell you, is warfighting and being able to operate with allies. And at the heart of that, there's a lot of those big ticket items, you know, ships and planes and missiles and what have you. And I think that's where a distinction can be raw. I mean, if we could have a military, I don't know whether it would still be a military, that didn't train to kill people but trained to resolve conflict, trained to protect people, trained to engage with different groups like they did in PNG. Fantastic. That would be perhaps a great transition.
And we'll stop. That'll be it.
And then I think we've probably had one waiting for a long time at the back, and that's
Okay.
probably it. So I'm sorry.
Cool. Thanks very much, Richard, and that was really inspiring. I've got a bit of a tough question for you. And the question is, if you were Hamas, what would you do? And I'll just preface that by saying that, you know, the Palestinians have had a number of non-violent activities like the Great March of Return, where hundreds of them were gunned down, 6,000 according to the UN were maimed permanently, etc. All sorts of events where they protested peacefully and got dealt to very severely. So if you were advising Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas, what would you be telling him?
So that is a great question. I really like that question, and I'm glad you've asked it. I mean, the first comment I would just make, and it's based on the fact that one of my other areas of interest and one of my other areas of research is nonviolent resistance. And that is that all the evidence we have shows that if you don't give an oppressed people a nonviolent, viable option for pursuing their grievances, then violence is inevitable, right? And you know, even Gandhi said, I would rather you went and fought than you did nothing, right? So he recognized that in a situation of great oppression, you've got to do something. You've got to fight for your freedom, and you've got to fight for the freedom of others. I mean, I would never... I've got Palestinian friends and former PhD students and so on. I would never presume to tell them what to do, because I have not experienced what they've experienced. Although, you know, I feel certain that if I was a Palestinian, I would have joined a militant group. I mean, when you know what they suffer, you know, as per their daily lives and as per not doing anything wrong, but they still get picked up and tortured and beaten and see family members abused and so on, and have their futures and rights curtailed all the time. I mean, I feel certain that I'd be angry enough to join a militant group, particularly if I'd watched non-violent forms of resistance repeatedly fail and be repeatedly blocked. And I think that is the big lesson here, to my mind, is that if you don't give Palestinians a viable, non-violent, negotiated way out of their dilemma, you can't be surprised and you can't not expect them to fight. They're not just going to lie down and die. None of us would do that either.
Just a second. We've got questions over here.
Further to that one, the gentleman asked, you talk about Hamas. How do you get round the issue of Hamas? Stated aim is the complete annihilation of Israel and its right to exist.
I think we need to take the questions in order. We've got a question here and then a question there.
Yeah, hi everybody. I support the proposition, but I speak as an ex-military man who was born in the Second World War, and our horizon was very limited as a young man, and I joined and went to sea because I wanted to see the world, I wanted a good training and make good friendships and get the government to pay for it. It was as simple as that, really. But I had calculated that, well, we've just had a war and it's unlikely to be another one soon, so I might just escape the next war, which was true, because we had the Falkland Island War. But what has happened, we're a globe in space, and we all occupy a lifeboat adrift. So I agree, we need to, maybe the first time ever, we've been able to see a planetary point of view that it's time we work together in cooperation rather than as enemies. We live in an age of symbols, and somebody mentioned Anzac Day is coming up, and we've got a great symbol there, which is the poppy. You've mentioned the white poppy, wasn't it? Which has a negative connotation to me. It's like the War of the Roses, the white and the red. But I think one symbol that you mentioned that caught my ear was the blue beret. And one of the things we want to do is not be in opposition to the military, but try to support them, because in their hearts, they're doing their best. It's the same with the roads up in Northland, and you say, well, they didn't do a very good job. Maybe they didn't, but the designers didn't do a very good job. The local authorities didn't do a very good job. But the thing about the military is they got in and did their best, and they cooperated, and they were honest, and they were good guys, like the ones that I served with. So you have to preserve that message. So what I'm asking is, couldn't you change from a white poppy to a blue beret on Anzac Day?
Thanks. Hi. Good comments. Thanks. Rupert Watson. Yeah, I just wanted to bring. I mean, this is all well and good, but in terms of a debate, sort of security and defence debate, like in New Zealand, and I just got a question. Like, is there anyone here who's been, a New Zealand Defence Force personnel? No. One, two. Because this is the thing, and just and that really disappoints me. I've been a bandsman for 15 years. It doesn't quite apply to me. But so I know a lot of intelligent Defence Force people, and when they retire, I'm thinking, well, surely some of them, move on into civilian life. Surely some of them will become, good, well-informed commentators, consultants, whatever. And I just don't see any evidence of it. So the only really informed, the best person who we can find out about our defence policy and so on is Nikki Hager, who would be completely lost at Linton, but we've got this civilian person who is a real expert, and there's this huge gulf. And then at Parliament, you've got New Zealand First, it's very strongly nationalistic. Ron Mark has had his whole career with the defence, and and I'm looking for the Green Party, like what their policy is. And so the question is, how can we improve this debate here?
Well, yeah, no, that you've hit the nail on the head. I don't think we have a very good debate, and I think the whole point of this book is to try and spark some debate. And I should, reiterate that the arguments we make in here are not bad faith arguments about any member of the NZDF, and they're not about individuals. They're just to try and provoke some serious discussion about a very serious issue which affects our world, which I don't think we have that kind of debate in New Zealand. I mean, I've talked to many politicians and they say exactly the same thing. The level of foreign policy debate in New Zealand is very woeful amongst the public. I think it seems to be in a kind of an elite level activity that often takes place behind closed doors. Okay, well, maybe it's gotten worse.
We've got one final question at the back here, then we're going to have to stop.
I think, Richard, the other thing is if you do have a question, Richard, you're here for probably another 25 minutes.
Yeah, I'm here till around 7. So.
Okay, so you can catch him. This
and
is the last
I'm selling books as well.
Last question from the floor.
Okay, thanks for all this. It was easy to nod through everything that you were saying until we got to the end where you said, now having laid out a lot of stuff that I think people in this room will agree with, you said, now let's take the counter-arguments. And then you chose a couple of patsy counter-arguments and didn't give us the central one. And that's what I found really disappointing. When the question about Gaza came up, which was right on the nail, you stepped back straight into the just war position that sometimes there is a legitimate case for resisting, and in resisting to resist violently. And I think that's where we really need to push you. I don't believe the case that you've made can extend to a rejection of the idea of a just war. And I don't think that you've made a case that persuades me that violence does not always achieve its ends. On the negative side, there's the history of colonialism and imperialism, which had several centuries of big-time success off the back of the projection of military power. And on the small side, there is the history of successful resistance, and what you were talking about in Taiwan is precisely an example of where just war theory comes to bear. So what I'd like to hear from you, I think, is a really crisp statement. Do you think there is a domain of application for the theory of the just war, or don't you?
Okay, excellent question, and I'm happy that you picked up on that. I was trying to be a bit circumspect. The reality is, if you Google me, you'll see that I'm a very open and forthright pacifist. And I've written against just war theory. I've got academic articles that deconstruct just war theory and argue that, yeah, it just doesn't make sense. And so I don't believe that there's any genuine morality to using organized violence in almost any situation. I mean, even, you know, I read this article by a prominent pacifist philosopher at Cambridge who said something like, out of 12,000 historical wars, just war theorists agree on one case as being an example of just war theory, and that is the fight against Hitler. But even then, when you dig down into it, there were aspects of that war that were clearly unjust, such as the bombing of Hiroshima. And Dresden, yeah, absolutely, and other aspects to it. You know, the way in which the Bengali famine was used, killed 14 million people to keep supplies going to the British. There were aspects to that war that were very clearly unjust. But also, I mean, if you explore even World War II from the perspective of, I mean, did it achieve its goals? Did it prevent the rise, you know, fascism? Did it save the Jews? I mean, it failed on so many different areas that would be relevant to just war theory. The point I was trying to make about Hamas is just simply that even though I'm a pacifist, I don't think that that gives me the right to go around telling other oppressed people that they should not be fighting for their freedom, right? It's not for me to judge them. That's all I'm saying. And the broader point I'm making is that the use of violence just creates more violence, and the fact that the Israelis are trying to violently eradicate Palestinian resistance is just creating much more violence. The truth is, I'd like both of them to stop, but mostly I'd like the Israelis to stop because they are killing far more people and causing far more harm to the entire international system. Yeah, things like Gaza, the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide and others, they do throw up these very difficult cases. But one of the issues is that you have to think about it in terms of time. So one of the arguments that's often made against me as a pacifist is, well, what would you do about Hitler when he invaded, Poland? And that argument is constructed at a particular moment in time. Well, there's nothing that can be done at that particular time. But if you ask me, could we have stopped Hitler non-violently in 1933 or 1934 or 1935 or 1936? I think we might have. We possibly could have. And that is the point, is that we can stop future wars through our actions today. And I would argue that demilitarizing is one of the main ways we could stop future wars and future Gaza situations, Hitler situations, Ukraine situations, and so on. The point is we're constantly reacting. And the way we react reinforces the world that we live in and creates the next Hitler, the next Hamas, the next whatever. So we've got to stop it at some point. And I think, there are serious intellectual and moral arguments that would say, if we consider abolishing the military and talk about it, we might actually help save the world from future wars.
Richard, that was a really fantastic place to stop. I think we've all got lots of questions still and things in our minds that we'd like to check with you. Richard will be here for a short while, as I said, and buy his book. That might address some of your questions that you have. I'd like to say thank you so much, Richard, and I'm sure that everybody in this room has really found it incredibly interesting, and the depth of your exploration of moral issues, of issues to do with just war, etc., and your openness to discuss those with us has been really impressive. We have loved having you. Thank you so much.